Evening, everyone. Welcome to our July 30th, 2024 edition of Week to Week, the political roundtable from Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. I'm John Zipper. I'm the host for Week to Week, and I'm the Vice President of Media and Editorial at the Commonwealth Club. Very glad to see you here tonight, as well as everyone watching and listening online. It has been a wild couple of weeks. We all know that. Weird and wild. Yes. No promise that it won't get weirder or wilder. We had an assassination attempt, a big court win for former President Trump, the RNC, President Biden dropping out, the vice president being kind of elevated to the presumptive Democratic nominee. And out of all this, there's been a lot of news and especially social media chatter, kind of like, well, how do we pronounce her name? You know, Donald Trump is kind of pulling a Winston Churchill and he's purposely mispronouncing it. And then there's on social media lots of like graphical, definite things trying to show how to pronounce her name. So I'll just make it really clear. It's pronounced Harris. Really simple. You'll notice we're missing one of our panelists for tonight. Dr. Larry Gersten was called away on some personal business, and he sends his regrets. Our thoughts are with him, and we look forward to seeing him on the stage again before too long. However, I am very pleased to announce, or re-announce, since they are not strangers to our stage, our two panelists for tonight. On the far end is Tim Anaya. He's the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at the Pacific Research Institute. I can't talk.
Hello.
And in the middle is political journalist Carla Marinucci, former writer for Politico California Playbook, and the former, of course, senior political writer at the San Francisco Chronicle. Welcome back to both. Pretty sure you all know how we do it here. There are question cards spread throughout the room. If you have a question, write it down. We'll have some people collecting them periodically and bringing them up here. And a pro tip, the earlier in the hour you write down your question and get it in, the more likely we'll be able to work it into our conversation here. A question coming in at 6:55, probably not going to get in. So let's go not to the very beginning, but the beginning of the current weirdness, and that is, I guess 2 weeks ago, or almost 2 weeks ago, I've lost track of time, but we're sitting around on a Saturday afternoon watching the news or whatever is on in the background, and we learn there's this assassination attempt at a political rally. Donald Trump shot in this year. It was kind of bizarre, and to me at least, watching it, just because it seemed like, I can't believe I'm watching this live. Yeah. I'm not even sure this is what's going on. Tim, the head of the Secret Service has resigned in the wake of that shooting. Was that the correct move? What else do you think should or could happen?
Well, I think when you watch that and see that, and you see the gravity of the situation, it was one head turn from you actually watching an assassination live on television. And, it obviously, in what we saw right there and in the days since, it was a failure of law enforcement at multiple levels, notwithstanding how brave those agents were that day on that stage, and that there was only one death and two really serious injuries. Everyone there really should be counting their blessings. Now in the aftermath, it's time to do something government usually doesn't do a very good job of, which is oversight. And just how bad are things? And Democrats and Republicans don't agree on a lot, but this is one area where they all agree. You've seen the House created a bipartisan task force to kind of study what's going on with the Secret Service and recommend what changes or reforms need to be made. And if you notice the makeup of the membership, this isn't camera seekers on this committee. These are kind of more serious legislators who are actually going to do the work that needs to be done. I think the scary thing, and we were talking about this a little bit backstage, was this is important. We need to have these hearings. We need to dive into, are our presidential candidates, is our president, are the key dignitaries that the Secret Service protect, are they doing the job to keep them safe? But I also don't like that we keep talking about this. And that, the more you talk about this and the more you talk about the weakness is you fear, are we inspiring other bad actors and ne'er-do-wells out there to try again with somebody else? So I'm hoping we get to pretty quickly a resolution here and that the reforms are made that need to be made.
Carla?
You know, I totally agree with everything Tim has just said. I think on the political implications, I was watching it also live, John, and when former President Trump got up there and, you know, put the fist up and said, fight, I was like, this is over. It's over. I mean, how quickly things have changed, but it also underscored, this whole event underscored what a divided country we are, where you had, you know, people on the right were saying, this is some kind of deep state, you know, what's going on? And even and people on the left were saying, this is a little too weird. He gets up and does this. Well, you know, I mean, both sides had conspiracy theories about it. I think what we saw is going in, that gave Trump such a wave as he was going into the convention that it really looked like, you know, something you couldn't stop.
Yeah.
He had people suggesting, you know, he was protected by God, you know, et cetera.
Right.
I mean, he really fired up. His troops were so fired up going into that convention that it looked like a mission impossible for the Democrats at that point. And that's when Joe Biden made the move to get out.
There's more before we even get to that. So just before the convention started, or the same time it was starting, Judge Cannon dismissed the classified documents case against Donald Trump on the basis of she was buying into this theory that the Trump lawyers had presented of the special prosecutor was not appointed constitutionally or something like that. I'm not seeing any lawyers who are saying that that is going to withstand appeal, but nonetheless, it added to that incredible energy that then in Milwaukee, the RNC.
Absolutely. I mean, we forget how incredibly strong and invincible, really, Trump looked going into that convention in Milwaukee because of that. And a lot of Democratic voters were just demoralized at that point. There was not a lot of energy there. And things changed overnight. And that's been the real miracle and craziness of this election season, something like we've never seen before in this country.
Well, on the ruling, you know, what I think is an even more interesting ruling, and maybe even more powerful for Trump, it was the immunity ruling in the Supreme Court. And that is, it actually is, it's sad we have to have a decision like that for a president, but it is a fascinating case, because if you've ever been a government employee, that's one of the things, right, is it's kind of a basic legal standard that if you do your normal job, you can't be sued for your work. So legally, yeah, you do have to kind of find some standard for what's the line between what is you know, acceptable and what are you legally exposed to. And obviously the court issued their ruling. I think that's going to be heavily litigated. There are going to be a lot of little cases over the years, but the key in all of it, the Trump legal strategy was get these cases till after November. And on the ones that are remaining, I think it's very unlikely you're going to have a resolution in any of these cases before November.
Right. Well, so then the RNC took place. It was a successful convention. It captured that energy. It focused that energy on obviously the nominee and his vice president. We can get into that in a moment, his choice. But it also really demonstrated his party was united behind him, in both person and in policy.
Absolutely.
Perhaps to a degree I don't know that we've seen of any other. Maybe FDR had that in 36 or something like that.
It was Trump's party all the way, and I think it's just yet another measure of how much the landscape has changed in the last 2 weeks. We saw J.D. Vance being introduced to the country. At the time, he looked, you know, like this kind of very attractive, an author everyone knew, someone who was the focus of a well-known movie. Wow, this could be a problem for the Democrats. Well,
Now we got to the Sunday.
Could I say before
Please,
we
Tim.
jump on the convention, I agree
Yeah.
with that. I think the assassination attempt actually unified the convention because
Yeah,
right after the next day, they're kind of, I think maybe they make it up as they go along. It's not as planned weeks and months in advance as a convention normally is. But you saw Nikki Haley wasn't going to speak and was given a
That's
primetime
right,
address.
right, yes.
All the rivals, came in and gave very unifying speeches.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think in general, it was a successful convention. I look at it from the speechwriter perspective. And, we always do on our Next Round podcast, we analyze the State of the Union. And I always am the one that complains about, I call them the human props, the real people they hold up to, say,
yeah.
Mary Louise Smith would benefit from this. I thought that was the best part of the convention, was the real people that they had there. They told the story much more powerfully, I thought, than any of the speakers. The Gold Star families and the gal from New York whose husband was murdered, and kind of was the attack on, prosecutors like George Gascon and others that obviously, that's going to be part of the campaign. But little did we know it would be a good convention that would last for 2 days before we change the subject.
And,
Usually after
and the bump was not there.
Right.
And the bump was
Usually
not
there's a nice little convention bump. It dissipates, it goes away, but there's still usually a visible bump. And I was expecting he would get a good solid rise in the polls. And then Sunday happened. First of all, were you surprised either that he finally made this decision and or the timing of it? Tim or Carla first.
I mean, coming out of after the post-assassination attempt and then COVID, I think that just kind of galvanized a lot of Democrats. And I think you have to give Nancy Pelosi credit here. Nancy Pelosi knows how to count the votes. And she laid it out to him, as people have said before me. She said we can do this the nice way or the not so nice way, and sat down and demanded to see the polls with Biden's campaign. I think the pressure just got to be too much, and it just became, between COVID, the bump coming out of the convention, the assassination attempt, and the unity of the Republican Party, and the desperation of Democrats. A lot of them were hoping months ago that Biden would have pulled out. So I think the pressure was just too much. Not to say that everybody was behind Kamala Harris at that point. There was still a lot of doubts about her. I think a lot of those doubts had dissipated in the last week. But yeah, it was a moment on a Sunday, and it just pulled the rug out from Trump and the whole RNC.
You wonder, and I always love there's always a reporter or two that is embedded with the presidential campaign, and they're embargoed from telling you what their reporting is until after the election. Then they make lots of money with their best-selling books that come out the following spring. I will be fascinated to read this year's version of those books to see what happened in Delaware that weekend. Because stuff went down that we still don't know what happened.
Right. Yeah.
All the things Carla talked about were happening, but you still needed a willing participant to go along with all of those things. And up until when he got on that airplane in Las Vegas, he was not a willing participant by any means. And actually, the language they were pushing back, even in his Las Vegas trip, was getting kind of ugly on their side, that they were prepared to keep going. So you just wonder, was it a throw in the towel, all this, and now I got COVID? Did that do it? Was there another friendly persuader that came in that we didn't know about to say enough is enough?
And I think some of those polls showing the swing states were being lost one by one.
Some of them huge swings,
Yeah.
huge 12 points down, I think. In one.
Outside the margin of error, states that Biden had in his pocket, and it was just too much. I think he saw the writing on the wall.
We talked about this in the green room. Trigger warning for any true Joe Biden stance here. I'm not trying to attack you, but if any of you can get a copy of the most recent issue of New York Magazine, not the New Yorker, New York Magazine, with Olivia Nuzzi's article reporting on how Democratic donors and Biden supporters for about a year have been saying among themselves, right? They're not saying it publicly. They don't want to hurt him. They don't want to hurt the campaign. But they were having experiences where he did not recognize lifelong friends. He was zoning out. He was, very, very low energy. I mean, to the point where they were really, really fearful. They weren't saying anything publicly. Of course, now these things are starting to come out. But
Yeah.
isn't this what the 25th Amendment was for?
Well, I have to say that, in fairness, we had a situation where we have two aged candidates who were both showing signs of decline in very obvious ways. So I think that was part of the reason why Biden was able to hang on as long as he did, because they could point to some of the stuff Trump was saying.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. But you just wonder, it's not an overnight thing. And so when the story is told, when we learn, and maybe it's going to be years from now, just how bad has it been over the last, year plus? We've seen the public moments, but if you think about it, he's not been in public a heck of a lot this year. We remember the State of the Union, the debate, foreign trips, not much else, really that certainly was a memorable moment. Not very many, the interviews he did were pretty awful, one after the other. And you can see it obviously now in hindsight, you can see, wow, something's not quite right there. Just wonder, how long has this been going on?
And you can see the contrast now in just a week. The kind of events and the structure of the events that Kamala Harris is doing, her one tonight in Atlanta, was just gangbusters. I mean, tens of thousands of cheering people and, rappers and dancers and all. I mean, and she knocked it out of the park. And that kind of thing, I think a lot of Democrats are missing that from Joe Biden.
They were. I just want to throw in one other nugget before we get fully into the Kamala Harris part, which is that some of you might remember when news came out that then former President Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's. People were kind of starting to do the backwards math and
Right.
And they're saying, this would have been affecting him pretty significantly, or at least noticeably, in his last couple of years in office too. Facts of life are bipartisan, as I guess
We all have relatives who have gone through Alzheimer's or dementia or, serious health declines, and it's a natural thing. You wonder, when did those signs first start to manifest themselves? And you'll never know. It's going to be to history, I think, at this point.
And, I got to say, these are questions that Trump is going to continue to face in the next, 97 days? That's going to be a challenge for him.
Okay, you've all been very good. Let's talk about the Democratic presumptive nominee for president, Kamala Harris. Went out of the gate raising a huge amount of money and probably what most people were not expecting, riding a huge wave of enthusiasm from a party that kind of had started to think they were on like the Baton March.
Right. I mean, $200 million and about 200,000 volunteers signed up in the first 48 hours of her campaign.
And am I right that there was that 200 million and then there was an additional 150 million for related groups?
Yeah, I mean, Zoom calls with 200,000 people. It's the kind of numbers we've never seen before.
Yeah.
This doesn't mean this campaign is a lock. I still view Kamala Harris as the underdog in this campaign.
Why?
Because of the Electoral College map, because of some of the means that the Republican Party is taking in some key states in terms of election integrity, how that may restrict the votes, how they may challenge the votes in certain states. We'll see how that plays out. And then there's Kamala Harris. We've seen her campaigns here in San Francisco. We know her campaigns better than any place else here. We've seen firsthand her first campaign for president, Kamala 1.0. That wasn't so successful. She has had her ups and downs. But I do think there is a big difference from the first presidential campaign to what you're seeing today. it's like she is firing on all cylinders today. And she's got a campaign team behind her, Joe Biden's campaign. She just plugged into that campaign, and it has gone flawlessly in terms of her speeches, the kind of events she's doing. That wasn't always the case with her. And, you know, whether you're talking about her race as DA or as Attorney General here in California or even the U.S. Senate, she's had her moments. And she could still have her moments. We still got a while left.
By moments, you mean difficult.
Yeah. I mean, right?
We have 9,700 lifetimes to live between now and election day.
Exactly.
So,
right, exactly.
You know, we're going. I think on the point of the underdog, I think, though, that what was very impressive was the field being cleared in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Now, some of that could be maybe her rivals are underestimating her and thinking, well, I don't want to get in this now. Let her run and lose, and we're set for 2028. I'm sure that thought crossed a few minds of governors and senators across the country. But
Gavin Newsom, maybe?
Gavin Newsom, maybe, perhaps. But if you, again, going back to the gossipy political books that I like to read, one of the things that was very interesting, I think it was in the Jonathan Martin book. Go back to the time when Joe Biden was picking his running mate. And remember, he had said, I'm going to pick a black woman as my running mate. Kamala Harris actually wasn't the leading contender for vice president. Karen Bass was the leading contender for vice president. Now, if you believe the gossip in that book, Kamala's team, I don't know how much she herself participated in this, but there was a little bit of elbows out against Karen Bass, and strategic leaks about she gave a speech to Scientology groups that were weird.
That's right.
She made a trip to Cuba you might want to check into a little bit. And all of a sudden, Bass was out and Harris was the one. So I think we probably underestimate her a little bit. Maybe that's one of those things we'll know in history down the road is
In fact,
what did she do in those 24 hours?
Her biographer, Dan Moraine, who I know very well, has written that Kamala Harris is maybe one of the most underestimated political figures in America. And look, you have Trump right now saying that, you know, she's a loony and DEI candidate and, you know, didn't deserve to get where she's at. The fact is she's been elected numerous times statewide in the nation's most populous state. And from San Francisco, where, as we all know, local politics is a blood sport here. It is not an easy arena to get elected. And to get elected DA, let's remember, back in the day, she was up against Terrence Hallinan, who was his nickname was KO, that's knockout. I mean, he was a boxer, and well known, and, a fighter. And nobody thought that she could beat him. She was in a three-way race there and came out ahead.
So what about the people who have said, and not necessarily critical of her, but who have still said, she and the Democratic Party would have been better off if they went to a contested convention, that they would have that fight internally, and then she could, A, be the victor of it, if she's the victor, and if not, they would get a candidate who had the buy-in. That suggestion kind of withered away pretty quickly when she
I think Democrats were just exhausted by that point and said, that look, this is almost kind of like what we saw in the Schwarzenegger recall here in California. 90 days, let's just do it. New face, new energy, and let's get this over with. And that kind of, quick turnaround, I don't think they wanted to go through a long, protracted fight. And they knew that time is running out on any kind of, a campaign, and saw her as the answer.
I think you're right. I think some of it too, they just wanted a candidate. It's not like Joe Biden was lighting the world on fire on the campaign trail. He wasn't really doing any rallies or big events at all. So that you just have a candidate who, has energy and kind of reflects the passion of the base, but is more mainstream electable. This is someone you can get around. But where I think the 90-day thing could come back, in the postmortem, if she's ultimately unsuccessful, is, a normal presidential campaign, 18 months or 2 years, however long they go, it gives you a lot of time to kind of iron out the kinks, test out things that work or don't work. You get your sea legs as a candidate. History is littered with presidential candidates who look great on paper, but when they get out there, fall flat on their face. And so there's no question she's having an incredible rollout, the rallies, the speeches, but there are a lot of things where she still has to clear a hurdle. She hasn't had a major national interview with an independent journalist grilling her on a record. How's she going to handle those? The debate, that's a whole nother story. How is she going to handle that? Which we remember from 2020, that moment with Tulsi Gabbard, it wasn't a mortal wound, but I bet she still has a bruise from that moment on the stage. So there are a lot of things. And then, of course, the record. How do you kind of position yourself to be an electable general election candidate in 2024, where in California and in past campaigns, you've had to take positions that aren't very politically helpful today in this moment.
And I think this is where Kamala Harris may have learned some important things. Remember when she was interviewed by Lester Holt on the issue of immigration, and he said, well, you haven't been to the border, and she said, well, I haven't been to Europe either. What's your point? Laugh, laugh. That was a really not a good answer, right. And a low point. Tonight at the rally in Atlanta, she just punched back at Trump on immigration right out of the box at that rally. She got cheers by saying, look, he has blocked us on immigration reform here, 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 and here, and I'm not going to do that as president. And then she went after him on the debate and said, hey, if you got something to say it to my face. I mean, she's like, bring it on. That is what she has said in these rallies. And this is like, that's just a strong, a change and a strong change. Yeah. And I have to wonder how it's playing with voters who have now seen Donald Trump since 2016.
The escalator ride.
Yeah, the escalator ride, right. And maybe they're a little exhausted because it is a lot of the same.
Right.
Right?
It is.
Do you think Donald Trump will agree to debate her?
I think he has to, but this is going to be a whole different debate from the weird moment, I hate to use that word since that's become a meme, but, when he went behind Hillary and kind of looked a little crazy and she didn't confront him.
Right.
And Kamala Harris was asked, what would she do if Trump did the same thing in her debate? And she said, I would turn around and say, why are you being so weird?
Right.
So
that's right.
It will be a show if he does it.
Right.
But he has already suggested he may try to get out of it.
He doesn't, he said, he agreed to a debate with Joe Biden, but he hasn't agreed to a debate with her. And then they've said he doesn't like George Stephanopoulos, so he doesn't want to go on ABC, apparently. And, that can be a fight over, who are we going to have do it and when. But you know what? It's a big show. He can't help himself. He's not going to be away from the big show. That is going to be the main event. And whenever they do it, may not be September 10th, but whenever they do it, he's going to be there.
It will be huge.
Okay. Let's talk vice presidential picks, and let's start with the one we already know about. We mentioned J.D. Vance. He's had a bit of a rough time.
Who, Tim, you said he was here in
He was
Palo
in Palo Alto last night for a big fundraiser.
Doing a fundraiser.
Anyone see him?
Silicon Valley?
Did anyone go there?
Anybody here?
No J.D. Vance bundlers here? Okay. But first, okay, Carla, first make the case for Trump having picked him. Why was he considered a strong candidate? And then
I think
happened?
they were on such a high from the convention that Trump felt he didn't need to, he just wanted to reinforce the MAGA energy. And J.D. Vance was exactly that guy and is that guy. But whether they vetted him or not, is the question. Usually you do opposition research and you unearth any kind of weird quotes or things like that, and cat lady kind of stuff. And from all accounts, his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, as well as Peter Thiel, a billionaire tech mogul from here in the Bay Area, were really pushing for Vance. Whether now that's going to be, something they're going to regret, I think we're going to be seeing that, or maybe already seeing that.
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think one, And you're right. You know, it seems like the Trump organization likes to play things fast and loose, and we go on instinct, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. We were saying backstage, you should hire my friend Joe Rodota, who's the best opposition research guy in history and has a great podcast if you're interested in learning about how it works.
What's it called?
Opophile, I believe.
I think it's called Opophile, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they obviously didn't do that. You know, the thing about it is they had a couple of schools of thought, right? So before the verdict and before the assassination attempt, Trump campaign was broke. I mean, they all the millions were going to legal fees. They needed cash. And so the thinking at that time was, you know who'd be a great vice presidential candidate is the governor in North Dakota, Doug Burgum, who's got a lot of money and is pretty inoffensive, you know, that he would, you know, be a pretty unifying choice in the party. He's not going to light the world on fire, but an interesting guy, especially on energy issues. Well, then, you know, we had the, you know, who knows when the pick actually was made. That's always a thing. You're never quite sure. Remember, Donald Trump kind of announced Mike Pence, but then he went on Twitter and said, I didn't pick Mike Pence, and then came back. So you never know when it actually happens. But I think it's an example of that was a decision that made sense in the context of that week where when I was sitting at home watching it, I said, they're too cocky. They're walking around confident like the election's over and you don't know the half of it. And obviously it's true. Now, what's the rationale for Vance? Vance was picked for 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. If he, you know, he's basically going to live there, his life story, and, you know, has the great book, Hillbilly Elegy, and if you watch the movie, if you don't want to read the book, it was stunning. You know, one of the things in his speech, and his speech was okay. I notice, I put the speechwriter hat on. He didn't really, those are hard speeches because for the running mate, usually some speechwriter is writing a dummy speech without the principle known, and then they pour the syrup of the candidate at the last minute when they're known. So they don't get a lot of time to have a speech that's their flair and their comfort level. So his, you know, kind of the applause lines were off, and it wasn't the sharpest, crispest speech. But the best part of it was his mom was there. And if you read the book or watched the movie, it's stunning that she's alive, let alone 10 years later, clean and sober and there on the stage. That's powerful. That's people in those 3 states. That's an experience, sadly, too many people are living in their families. Basically, you know, come November, if Donald Trump wins all those 3 states or wins enough of them to get 270, it was a brilliant pick. If he doesn't, it's a really bad pick.
But,
Not only that, he'll be blamed.
And he'll be blamed.
He'll be
It won't be
blamed, right.
Donald Trump's fault.
I mean, but in the interim now, we've all these comments about childless people have surfaced, and
Specifically, it was childless cat owners.
ladies. But
Yes.
yeah, but then he's since doubled down.
Yes.
And basically suggested, you know, people with children should have sort of a greater voice in voting, et cetera, that they should have more tax breaks, et cetera, which they kind of, you know.
They do,
I mean, he has not apologized anyway. He's doubled down on those comments, and I think women are especially. I mean, there's like childless cat ladies for Kamala now.
Right.
You know, there's like, I mean. It has fired up Kamala's team. I'm just curious, Tim, whether you think there's some discussion. Would Trump replace him on the ticket? That's impossible, is it not?
Well, I don't know. We'd have to get our ballot access people to figure out, you know, could they do it?
I mean,
you know, is he behind the scenes having buyer's remorse? Probably. When we read the gossipy book after the election, we'll know if he is. But I think all of that stuff shoots you in the foot, right? This election is likely, once again, going to be decided by 50 to 75,000 voters in 3 states. And most of those voters are Republican and Republican-leaning women. So if you want to win, who may not, you know, they may not be comfortable with Kamala Harris's policy positions. But when the Republican candidate is coming out, calling them names and really insulting them,
right.
But I think about it across gender. I'm a childless person. I think I did pretty okay working in public service. You know, just because you don't have a child doesn't mean you can't set budgets, set major policy, do all of these things. Not to say that it isn't an important perspective either, but the way he says it and the, you know, the real, if you watch the Megyn Kelly interview, the look on his face, what's happening here? That stuff they have to, and is that stuff fixable? But that's the worry, right? When you don't do the vetting, when you don't have the full, you know, are there, we were just talking about it from Kamala Harris in the past, are there 100 TV clip moments on talking about policy or things that you cringe now and are kind of made for TV commercial attack ads? 100%. But obviously they're the same for J.D. Vance. And so the question really is going to be, you're going to have that national, is that going to hurt you nationally? Is that going to hurt you in Arizona? Is that going to hurt you in Nevada? Is that going to hurt you in Georgia? But how does it play in the three key states that he's there for? Maybe it's not as big a deal in those 3 states, but I got to say, that's not a way to come out of the gates telling folks, you know, really pretty awful insult, I think.
Is that where you want to spend your political capital in a tight election? Yeah. Going after cats. Well, okay, so we don't know yet who Kamala Harris is going to choose. We know some of the names that have been tossed out there. A couple of them have taken themselves out of consideration, whether that's because they've been told they're not going to make it or they genuinely think they should stay as governor of Michigan or something. But talk about some of the people, Carla, start.
I mean, I think among the names being tossed around, Pete Buttigieg is one I think is fascinating. I covered his presidential campaign. And I remember asking him at the time, you know, he's such a strong communicator and probably the strongest communicator of the bunch. I mean, goes on Fox News, just nails the points every time he's there. But I remember asking him as a presidential candidate, is a gay man a bridge too far for a lot of voters out there? And you know, I think he had a good answer then, and he has an even stronger answer now. I mean, Americans are overwhelmingly in favor of gay marriage now. That is not and most people who are in the political game will say the VP pick, really, that's not who voters are voting. The VP pick has to be somebody who is the strongest advocate, the strongest messenger for your presidential candidate, and that is Pete Buttigieg. So a lot of people were concerned, is he too risky of a choice? But on the other hand, it could be a moment in American politics like the Clinton-Gore ticket was. It was a turn the page choice to have 2 men from the South. And a lot of political analysts said, oh, you can't do that. And they said, no, yes, we can, right? And this may be a moment where it's a turn the page gesture, and it may be another thing that fires up that whole generation of younger voters, Gen X, millennials, who were not going to go to the polls, many of them, or less likely to, and they will be there for them. I mean,
and big money too.
Yes.
Big fundraising. Friends, wouldn't you love to watch the J.D. Vance, Pete Buttigieg debate? You could charge admission for that one, right? So that is kind of the one way, right? That you have someone who, like, you could see them, like, as a partnership, they would work very well together. The other thought would be pick a governor or a senator that gets you a state, that either gets you votes you need or blocks them from the other guy.
Yeah.
And so the names that are kind of kicked around, one is Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona.
Right.
And he's been kind of pushed as, well, you know, obviously he's got a military background, he's an astronaut, a hero, wife of Gabrielle Giffords. So you have, now that cuts both ways in the toss-up states on the gun issue. Now, his key point that people have been saying is he has figured out the immigration issue, and that could help her do that. Now, I would argue he ran 2 races for Senate, yes, in a Republican-leading state, but against 2 very weak candidates. So did he figure out the immigration issue, or did he just luck out being a more stable candidate running against weak Republican candidates? The other one is Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Now, I kind of knew of him, but I had never seen him on TV or give a speech before. And the day after the assassination attempt, he gave a press conference on the side in front of the hospital somewhere, and it captured my attention. I watched the whole thing and I thought, look out for that guy. That guy is a future president of the United States. He has the stature, he's smooth, that's a guy to watch. In thinking about him as a running mate, he actually might outshine the presidential candidate. So that's a thing you might have to worry about. But the issue with him that is an awkward one for any Democratic candidate, and certainly a Kamala Harris is, now in this time with Israel and Gaza, he's a Jewish American. And that could be an important thing for her to have him on the ticket, but it could bring that issue up over and over again, where I'm sure she'd like to deal with it once and not keep talking
And the
about it
far left
throughout.
has already targeted him in some ways. I mean,
That's right.
That's exactly right.
So that could be one where, well, you have to, endure a few angry voices on one side for we're going to put the election away on the other side.
Most of the names I've heard are names of relatively moderate Democratic governors.
The Minnesota governor.
Minnesota governor,
Yeah.
Illinois governor, Bashir, Cooper also took him, Roy Cooper of,
He took himself out, I think.
yeah.
Now, if you believe the Twitter I was reading today, allegedly, Governor Bashir today got an increased security detail.
I did see that, yes.
So
What does that mean?
I don't know what that means, but maybe that's a tea leaf for you all to read over the next few days.
It would mean losing the governorship of that state, right? And
Yes, it
he's
would.
Certainly going to be replaced by a Republican.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about kind of the down market and the tailcoats of the candidates. How might now things have changed, at least on the Democratic side, for maybe certain Senate races or congressional races? Does having Harris there and kind of a re-energized party, I assume, would help them, or does it not? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I
And
mean,
where?
there's a number of important House races here in California, and this is where, prior to the Biden, departure, Democrats are kind of worried about that. Obviously, Kamala Harris has a good connection with a lot of these candidates in California. I mean, Latifah Simon, who's the candidate, who obviously there's a very strong Democratic district across the bay, held by Barbara Lee currently. But Latifah Simon was mentored by Kamala Harris. She was a kid on the streets in San Francisco, brought into some programs here, and really sort of turned her life around, and is very, very, very tight with Kamala Harris. Those kind of races are going to be interesting. London Breed is going to be interesting to watch. Kamala Harris and London Breed are close, and I think London Breed will probably argue she'll be able to have a hotline to the White House if Kamala Harris is elected, as will Karen Bass down in LA. There's a number of races here in California, and Kamala Harris's deep connection to California. I've covered her. She's and when she and Gavin Newsom campaigned in a lot of the House races in California, she knows the people in these districts. She's been through all these districts on a granular level. So I think for those races, this is going to be something to watch.
It'll help with money.
Yeah.
It'll help with enthusiasm. In California, I don't think every battleground race it'll matter, but if you're Will Rollins down in Palm Springs, that probably puts a little wind in your sails. If you're the Dem running against Young Kim, probably doesn't
Right.
matter. So it depends where it's at. Now, in the Senate races around the country and the other races,
That's right.
it cuts both ways. So you're seeing the marquee Senate race of 2024 is Pennsylvania. And Senator Casey is running for re-election against McCormick. And McCormick already has a pretty devastating ad out. Casey went on one of these webinars and said, laudable things about Kamala Harris. And then the next 60 seconds is, these are all the things you're now tied to. So they don't want to be tied to necessarily what her agenda is, but having her running a vibrant campaign can't help but be helpful
Right.
in all of the states. But I think you would continue to see she's not going to go to Montana and campaign for Senator Tester. She's not going to go to Ohio and campaign. You know, they're going to give them the space. They're going to run their independent races. And then, you know, you will see. If she gets ahead of steam, maybe you might start to see some ticket splitting and some strategic voting. We need to have checks and balances. That very well could happen if things continue like we've seen in the first week. But other than for money, I think most of the states and most of the battleground districts and people are going to have kind of a hands-off.
So before the weirdness of the past couple of weeks, a fair number of Democrats were starting to despair of the House. They had previously thought, oh, we have a really good chance to win it back, and then they're like, with Biden was pulling down the ticket.
Right, and that was
Do you agree
Pelosi's
with
argument.
that?
That was Pelosi's argument.
Yeah, and so then, do you think this changes it? Are they in a good position now, or is it local issues that are going to be driving it? Kamala Harris doesn't really matter.
I'm biased, of course, having worked for who I thought was a pretty good Republican Speaker of the House for an all too brief 8 or 9 months. But, I think what has been the killer has been there's no better political strategist and fundraiser for Republican House candidates than Kevin McCarthy. Now you don't have that. And Mike Johnson's had to build a team on his own. I think he's been okay, but the question is, we saw in this state in 2020 and 2018, when Democrats made a lot of gains in House seats in California, particularly in 2018.
Right.
Some of those races, the Republican candidate was outspent, like, I'm not exaggerating, 8-1, 9-1. I remember Steve Knight, former Congressman Steve Knight, when he was defeated by Katie Hill, Mike Bloomberg spent like $5 million against him in one weekend. That's hard to overcome. You need to have, win the lottery 20 times over to have that kind of money. So that's the issue is, in the key races, are you going to keep it close?
Yeah.
Democrats probably will raise more money than Republicans for the House, but are you going to keep it close where you can all get you're not just buried by that kind of money? But again, that's where you might see, as things go in October, if there's a feeling that the presidential race is trending strongly one way, well, the big donor money and the third house lobbyist money and all of that may start to flow a different way in the congressional races.
And when you're talking about money, I mean, organizations like Act Blue are it is rolling into them,
Yep.
and we're talking about first-time donors.
Yeah.
So that's where the Democrats may have, a
And
really-
$20 here and there,
Yeah.
they can come back and give
Correct.
over and over and over again.
Right.
One of the other things I wanted to talk about will sound like I'm pivoting to a different topic, but I think people are saying it's related, and that is, here in the state of California, Governor Gavin Newsom recently issued an executive order for state agencies. This doesn't tell counties and cities what to do, but for state agencies to clear homeless encampments on state ground. So basically what he was saying was follow Caltrans' lead, because they've been having to do this to get encampments and dangerous things from tracks and things like that. Obviously, there's been a lot of snarky response saying, oh, isn't this interesting? You're doing this as a help to Kamala Harris to try to reduce that issue as an issue for her, because obviously the Bay Area and California are going to be front and center in this election.
Absolutely, and they already are. I mean, you could do a drinking game on how many times Republicans are using, San Francisco liberal, San Francisco radical, and what's happening in San Francisco. I mean, I've heard a couple of speeches from Donald Trump in the last week where he says, it used to be such a great city, and now, look at it. And
Now it's like Milwaukee.
Yes, San Francisco, the crime, the homelessness is absolutely front and center. And Republicans are making this an issue. But on this issue of cleaning up the homeless encampments, this is something that came out of a Supreme Court decision
Grants
that,
Pass.
and when you talked to Lyndon Breed, she said, this is something that they've been waiting for, essentially, the go-ahead to actually, after offering folks out there shelter and services, if they refuse to accept, to say, okay, well, you're not allowed to camp here anymore. That's something that's happening now as we speak in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Gavin Newsom is on board there. Why? Because this is an issue that has plagued him as well. So I think Democrats very much welcome that decision. And this is something that Republicans were ready and able to use and are still going to use against San Francisco as this election continues.
Right. That Grants Pass ruling was a huge decision. PRI filed an amicus brief in that case. Gavin Newsom filed an amicus brief. You should look at the list of everybody who filed amicus briefs in that case. It's people who aren't always on the same side of the issue. And really what it meant was we had a Ninth Circuit decision back in the day. It was the Boise decision. And it basically tied the hands of the ability of cities to clear out homeless encampments. Now that's gone, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling. So Newsom is looking at it a little bit optic. Okay, there's no excuse anymore. I'm going to issue this executive order and order things to keep going. But the issue is, it only applies to kind of parkland and state parklands. He can advise cities to do it. And so here in San Francisco, it's going because London Breed agrees with them, and she wants to get, those encampments cleared. Mayor Bass doesn't agree on Grants Pass. So it's probably not going to have much of an impact there. But I think the big thing on this issue, and where we were talking earlier about government oversight, a lot of state policy, there's a lot of work PRI has done on this, a lot of this is about spending money. But we're not looking at, are you getting your bang for your buck? We've spent $12 billion plus on Governor Newsom's Project Home Key initiative. It hasn't really made a dent on homelessness, and it's very expensive per unit to build the units under his initiative. The state auditor just issued a scathing audit questioning not only California's approach, but the approach of cities. We're spending this money. Do you have controls in place? Are you really looking to see, is this working? So I think voters want results. And so Governor Newsom has to be careful when he issues an executive order. Yes, you might get a day or two of this, but are we changing things? Are we cleaning it up? Are we, folks aren't in storefront windows anymore and all of that and on the streets. And so it's, he's had a good week with this movement, but what's the long term going to be? And I think that's ultimately how he's going to be judged.
Okay. Well, before we get to the news, because let's get to some questions from the audience. What will be Joe Biden's legacy as a one-term president?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think Joe Biden, and that was one of the reasons why he was reluctant to pull out of this race. He felt like he has done when you talk about the economy, when you talk about infrastructure particularly. I mean, he was a president that actually invested in infrastructure, or something that was ignored for years. And I think that's going to be one of his major legacies. He's getting roads, bridges built around the country at this point. The jobs picture is another one. I think the issue of the border is an area where he's going to have to continue to take. He will continue to take criticism for not recognizing it, not addressing it quickly enough. Even though border entries now are down since the beginning of the year, lower than they were during the Trump years.
I think all of those things, but of course, how you view the legacy will be how you judge the record. I think one thing, sadly for the country, is the Afghanistan withdrawal. That's a huge moment, tragedy for our country. That's going to be, I think, in every history book about this presidency. That's going to be, an unfortunate, really tragic moment. And I think the other thing you have to, the way he came in the aftermath of January 6th and trying to bring everybody together and have unity, those were, that time, January 2021, we've lived 3,000 lifetimes since then. But that was a pretty raw time. And so that he kind of steadied things, at least calmed down the tone and tried to get us back on track to fight about issues not in front of the Capitol.
Also bringing the country out of COVID, obviously, and helping the recovery there. But I think the final commentary on his legacy will be this election. I mean, if the Democrats lose, he will be blamed for not getting out quickly enough.
Interesting. So there are a couple of questions that I'm going to merge together, and they kind of jump right off on that.
Yeah.
And that is, if Donald Trump loses, do you think we're facing another challenge to the very legitimacy of the system? What role might the Supreme Court play? What would you expect to have happen there? Can you do some crystal balling?
Well, I think if history is a judge, yes. This is one of the things, and one of the faults I had with their campaign last time. There were a lot of changes to voting laws in California and in other states. California had done it many years before, but there were in states, leading, because of COVID. Well, the time to challenge those laws is in May of 2020 and June of 2020, before people vote. There are legitimate legal and constitutional issues about the law changes. But once the election is set, kind of the rules are in place, no judge in America is going to throw out people actually voting. You saw here with the debate about the ballot measure, the Business Roundtable ballot measure that they threw out. Those judges on the California Supreme Court, they took, you would think, oh, that's kind of weird that you would throw this out before the election. It's for that very purpose, because we want to throw it out now before 5 million, 8 million people have voted on this, and you're seeming like you're throwing out votes. So I don't think those cases will be successful post-election, but can you expect them? Of course. I don't know how many, but the RNC as a whole, attorney recruitment effort going on, and you have it on both sides. You want to make sure every lawful vote is counted. There sometimes are little snafus that happen in polling places. This is very different than that, though. So can you expect I couldn't have possibly lost and all of that? Of course, the question will be, if he loses, does he lose by 25,000 votes, or does he lose by a wide margin, and then it doesn't matter and you can turn off?
And I think the other question, as you said, no judge in America would overturn, but Eileen Cannon, the immunity decision. I think voters are now skeptical on whether their rights on the election would be protected in some respect.
On that note, and that, folks, is our program. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Tim Anaya and Carla Marinucci for a great conversation. Thanks to all of you here in the room and everyone watching and listening online. Have a great week. Stay safe. Be good. Stay informed. We'll see you again soon.
All right.
Woo! Thank you, John.